Okay.
Yes, starting recording.
Yeah, we are recording now. So good morning. Welcome to the IR Theory interview series. I am Dr. Jon Åberg, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Global Political Studies at Malmö University. In this interview series, we interview IR scholars about their preferred theoretical perspective. So the idea is to get a brief account of why scholars have come to appreciate a certain IR theory through a short interview. Today, I have the honor to interview a great scholar. Welcome, Professor Erik Ringmar.
Thank you.
Erik, please, before we start about the more specific questions about IR theory, tell me a little bit about your scholarly background, please.
I studied political science in Uppsala for my undergraduate, and then I continued on to the US, and I did my PhD in the United States. I was always very interested in international politics, but I was also interested in philosophy and political theory, I guess. So I did a combination of those things. And then I got a job in London, and I worked in London for 12 years. And after that, I've been taking the opportunity to see the world. So I embarked on this kind of scholarly tourism. I was in China for 7 years, and now I live in Turkey.
Okay. That's very interesting. Scholarly tourism. That's an interesting concept. So you have been in many different universities.
Well, yeah, I also worked quite a long time.
Yeah. I know you, and perhaps that is wrong. At least I knew you before as a hardcore constructivist, if I put it like that. What are some of the constructivist insights when it comes to IR research in general and your own research in particular? And feel free to elaborate on that stereotype of hardcore constructivist as well.
Okay. Well, I started to study international politics when I was doing my PhD really in the US in a serious way. And this was back in the 1980s. It's a long time ago now. And at that point, there were basically two main schools. One was very empiricist, very empirical, looking at facts. And the other one was more theoretical, but it was realist. So they were interested in concepts having to do with security and national interests and things like that. And at that time, there was quite a lot of, well, people were feeling the limits of these approaches, because the realists tended to be foreign policy people, old diplomats or generals, and the empiricists were, at that time, often behaviorists, meaning that they thought of themselves as very scientific. They could measure the world and come up with facts about the world. And they were often very idealistic at the same time. So by means of science, you were going to bring about peace. And a lot of us at that time, I mean, I was in my late 20s at that time, and a lot of us, we started to read different types of accounts, not political science or IR so much, but rather like cultural studies, history. There was a very big name in anthropology at that time called Clifford Geertz, and he introduced this idea about cultural anthropology. So the idea is that when you study human beings, you study their culture, meaning that you study how they make sense of the world. So the world doesn't actually just exist up there. It's always a matter of how it's interpreted, what you make of the world. And if you don't understand what people make of the world, you don't understand anything, because the world itself is nothing, right? It's always your interpretation that matters. And then at that time, in the 1980s and 90s, this French philosopher, historian, Michel Foucault, was a very big name. And he did something quite similar, but he did it in a different fashion, more sort of big sweeps of history, right? But the idea was the same, which is that there's a certain way of thinking, there's a certain way of making sense of the world. And you cannot understand what happens historically, Foucault was saying, unless you understand this basic fundamental assumptions about knowledge and meaning. So anyway, I was reading very broadly at that time and all sorts of different things. And so were a number of my, friends and colleagues or whatever. And we decided kind of that we should try to do something similar when it comes to the study of international relations. So what if you take these ideas about meaning and about interpretation, and you apply that to international politics? And what you come up with then is something that's different from the empirical, scientific people, but also very different from the rationalist, realist people, because everything then depends on your interpretation. So unless you understand the interpretation, you cannot go on. There's no fact in itself. There's also no national interest. There's no security in itself either. All of this needs to be somehow made sense of. And what we were thinking at that point was that, well, it'd be really interesting if we could study how this sense was made. How do people come up with these ideas about the world? So this is why it became a kind of cultural study of international relations. Like the world too has a culture. International politics has a culture. You think the states, right, and you think that they're always fighting with each other. And maybe that's the case, but even always fighting with each other presupposes an understanding. And that understanding can be described as a culture. So you can talk about international cultures and how they can change, right? And then with these ideas turned out to be very, very powerful. And you're able to say a lot of things and to study international politics in a very different way. But at the same time, it has limitations, and I've come to realize the more I've been working with this that you have to go on, and this isn't good enough. But we had a lot of fun back then, because when you're a young scholar and you have ideas that you think are original, you can have a lot of fun. You can make your teachers angry. You can piss them off. You can go to conferences and make enemies, and oh, you haven't read Foucault. What an idiot you are. Why don't you read Foucault, you fool,
Okay.
So it was great fun back then to do this. But at the same time, the way I think about constructivism, I think about it as not really as a theory of international politics. There are different views on this, but the way I think about it as a really a kind of philosophical method or something. So it's a certain approach to the world, and that approach is a philosophical, methodological approach. You're saying that the world needs an interpretation, and for that reason, let me investigate the interpretation.
But if I can just if I can just interrupt you for a few seconds, if I understand you correctly, we could perhaps say that you were engaging in some kind of constructivist research, at least previously, but you also recognize that there are limitations to this constructivist research. What would those limitations be?
Oh, you're breaking up.
Okay, what would some of the limitations to a constructivist approach be?
Right. Yeah. No, I was very much involved in this, very much so, and my PhD and my first book was about this, and I tried to talk about the role of identities, for example, because before everyone had always only talked about interest, national interest, and they had assumed that national interest is just what states have. And I was trying to say, no, that's not true, because interests are always dependent on an identity. So it's the identity that gives you the interest. And if you don't understand the identity, what a state is, or who a person is, if you don't understand that, you don't understand very much about this situation, and you don't understand what the interests are. So you have to look at identities. And this was in the 1990s, everyone was talking about identities and recognition, and this is a big deal domestically in different countries, and it was a time of, migration and EU and all these things. A lot of countries started to ask themselves, like, who are we and who are they, and how should we relate to one another?
Mm.
So interests and identities became very important tools. But for me at that time, it was very much a question of how identities are interpreted. How do you know who you are, right? You have to somehow interpret your personality, your place in life. How do you know that other people are the way you think they are? Well, you have to investigate, right? You have to kind of come to know their identity.
Mm.
So all of this is about meaning. It's about interpretation. It's about culture.
Yeah, but some of the limitations that you mentioned, because you said
no,
that
that's right.
And if I know you correctly,
this is what,
sorry.
Yeah. So no, you're breaking up. I think it's my phone. I don't know.
Yeah, no worries. I just want to, I just want you to elaborate on those limitations, because if I know you correctly, I mean, you were in some sense a constructivist before, but you have now taken a stance against constructivism in some sense, or that you emphasize the limitations of constructivism. What would some of those limitations be?
Well, my teacher in the US was this very famous guy, Alex Wendt. And Alex Wendt is like the father of constructivism, if you like. So I guess, I was influenced by him, and we were developing these ideas at the same time there in the US. So from that point of view, in terms of my own biography, I developed within this constructivist framework. But it was almost like a kind of revelation. I remember exactly when it was happening. I read a particular article by an American philosopher called Mark Johnson. Mm. And in this article, he's talking about a French philosopher called Merleau-Ponty. And Merleau-Ponty has his arguments about the role of the body. And basically, it has to do with how we make sense of the world. And we make sense of the world, says this French philosopher, by the way in which we exist in the world, how we fit into the world. And this we do with our bodies, and also, of course, with our minds. And our minds and our bodies are connected, and they're connected to each other. They're the same thing, really. And they exist in a situation, and we engage with the situation also in a kind of interactive framework, a structure. And when you start to think about it like that, then ideas and interpretations become, that's to say, all this constructivist stuff, right? Ideas, interpretations, meaning, it becomes very cerebral. It becomes very much things that happen in your head, like ideas are things that you come up with and you process consciously in your head. But what this French philosopher was pointing out was that that's not how it works. That your body feels things, you move around, you make up a certain meaning in a much more basic way. If you eat a ripe, nice plum tomato, that has meaning to you. Mm-hmm. Although you might not verbalize it or put it into words.